It's me and your mom.
So it's now it's an hour and 10 minutes, just so you know.
We had the very first podcast I ever produced for Heckle Proof. We had Shane Bishop, a producer for Dateline NBC, or NBC Dateline. We kept getting it wrong. You're supposed to say one in front of the other. It's
Okay.
NBC's Dateline or
I don't know.
Dateline on NBC. I don't know. It's trademarked one way, or we had to make sure we got it. The very first setup ever. And you thought this took a while? We were in their living room, setting up lights, setting up cameras, setting up the audio equipment for the first time ever. And we have a producer from NBC coming and sitting in. And he just was trash talking me like, our team never takes this long to set up. And I was like, well, you have an NBC budget. Now I've got my mommy harassing me, just like Shane Bishop of NBC, for taking too long to set up.
That's the first time I've been compared to Shane Bishop.
Yes.
Okay.
Hopefully it's the last time. 'Cause
Okay.
I don't.
Do I need my phone?
No.
Oh, okay. Is that where your questions?
I have my notes on here. So, this is the very first Me and Your Mom podcast. I've been producing podcasts for other folks, and I never thought I would do my own until my mommy came to visit, and I wanted to show her my new studio, and I had the inspiration to create this whole idea of Me and Your Mom. And for the very first podcast, I know it's called Me and Your Mom, but this is me and my mom. So I want to ask you, Mom, would you introduce yourself? Pretend I've never met you. Let me know your name, who you are, where you came from, and where you are now.
So my name is Lori Anderson, and I come from Coal Valley, Illinois, which is where I was born in Moline. Coal Valley's a suburb, and I was the sixth of 7 children. I was the baby girl forever, and I was the baby girl for 9 years before my baby brother was born. So it's almost like there were 3 families with the age split between the children, but 19 years between the oldest and the youngest. And I went to school in the Quad Cities. I grew up there, and I moved to Oregon in 1978. And a few years ago, the CEO of Oregon Rural Electric Co-op asked me about, what is your story? And I said, I'd like to call mine From the Bicycle to the Boardroom, because my very first job was a newspaper boy. And I had a paper route that I delivered newspapers for 10 blocks on my bicycle. But in those days, in the early 60s, girls couldn't have a paper route. It had to be a boy. And my sister was faced with the same dilemma several years before when she had a paper route, but she had to have it in my brother's name. And he won a distribution award and won a free trip to New York City on my sister's back. So
Who got to go on the trip?
he got to go on the trip because girls weren't allowed to be newspaper boys. So I guess, and how I say to the boardroom is, sometime in the 80s, there was a position open on our local cooperative board, and it was advertised in the newspaper for a couple of months, and nobody was stepping up to the plate. And I called my boss and I said, what would you think about me throwing my hat in the ring for this position on the board for our local electric co-op? And he said, go for it. And I did, and I served on that board for 33 years. And then during that time, I was elected to the board of Oregon Rural Electric Cooperative, the statewide board. And I served on that board for 2 years as president. And then there was an opening on the national level for our cooperative partner that was an insurance company, Federated Insurance. And I threw my hat in the ring for that and won against an incumbent and served on that board for 9 years. And then when my term was up, that was the limit that you could be on that board. I finished out my term at my local co-op and retired from that after 33 years of service. So bicycle to Boardroom.
So when you got your first bicycle route, you couldn't self-identify as a boy back then, like you can today.
Why would I?
To win the trip for yourself and get to go on the trip.
I didn't
and not
win
let
any.
this
I
set your
didn't win any
But your
awards.
sister did. Yeah. So when you moved out to Oregon, you had my big brother in tow. Is that right?
That's
Because
right.
Jeremy was born in 76,
Yes.
4 years before me. That's math. I know math. What brought you to Oregon?
So I came to Oregon with my former husband and settled in Condon. And there I have 3 boys, Jeremy and Levi and John. So that's my story.
What did you do when you first got to Condon? What did you do for work?
I babysat other people's children and cleaned houses and cleaned buildings.
So I remember when I was growing up a little bit, there was it was a really small town, right? How big was Condon?
It's a 1 mile square, but population-wise, between then and now, somewhere always between 600 and 800.
Because I remember getting babysat. It was almost like a cooperative. Different moms would kind of take the reins for a period of time and kind of do childcare for, all the other moms. Is that kind of accurate? Like it was like, depending on which generation of kids was growing, it was like which mom had.
I don't remember that
Okay.
because when you got a little bit older, you went to preschool, and that was a cooperative, and so maybe that's where you got the idea that it was multiple moms because the moms had to volunteer. We didn't have the government involved in the structure of the childcare at that time, and I think Jonna McKay was probably your preschool instructor or in charge of the childcare at that time.
That sounds right.
But you were babysat by other mothers. You were babysat by the most memorable was Dorothy Schaefer, who's related to us. And she was babysitting you, and earlier in the month, after a rain, you had eaten mushrooms in the yard. And I had to call poison control and thought I had to describe the mushroom. And they said, don't take any chances, have them take Ipecac, which would make you throw up anything that was bad. So a few weeks later at Dorothy's house, it had rained again and there were mushrooms in her yard. And you had all the children that she was babysitting eat mushrooms with you. So she had to give Ipecac to everybody. So she was really happy that day that she had to have all these children throwing up at her house.
I don't think she was happy, but we played a game because we were counting how many times each person threw up. Because I don't know if it's accurate or not. I don't know if they think it's on the label, but for some reason we had in our minds, you'll throw up 3 times off Ipecac. So we kept counting how many times each of us had thrown up until we'd all gotten 3 throw-ups.
But you were my star for eating things you shouldn't eat. I felt like I had poison control on speed dial. Because at that time we did not have the 911 system, so I had to have the number by the phone because you ate so many things that weren't normal.
I kind of explored the whole world with my mouth. Laundry detergent, lawn chemicals.
I don't think you had fertilizer tablets that were for house plants. You ate those.
Gotcha.
You ate Head and Shoulders shampoo. You
Well,
ate the head cleaner for cleaning the VHS tapes.
So I probably shouldn't tell you this, but in college, I ate mushrooms again. Purposefully this time.
I don't doubt it, and they were probably a different kind of mushrooms.
They were, and I just remember with my buddies, and it was with a good group of friends. We were kind of looked out for each other and experimented together. But I just remember going off in the woods on a hike and like pulling leaves and tasting the texture of everything with my mouth, just like I was a kid again.
I hope you didn't pull poison ivy leaves.
Yeah, there was probably some poison oak in there.
So you wanted to know how I met Dad.
Well, that comes later.
Oh, sorry.
After the helicopter. So, at that point, were you working at Coast to Coast? Was that a store at the time?
I did work at Coast to Coast. I was working there when I met Dad. So I worked there with Adrian Carnine, who was second generation owner of that store, and he had sold it, but for the new owners, he continued working. So I worked there with him.
What was Coast to Coast? That doesn't exist anymore.
Coast to Coast was a hardware store. So like Ace Hardware. It was a name brand that was national.
And then would Dad come in just looking all hunky like a cowboy rocker, looking for some tools?
No.
Oh, okay. So how did you meet Dad?
So there was this lady in town, and her name was Lynn, and she played guitar and sang at a bar in town. But her husband worked with Dad. And she approached me a number of times for well over a year that I should meet Kent. And she was approaching him saying he should meet me. And I kept telling her, no, 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 no. So that went on for at least a year and a half, maybe 2 years. And so one day he just knocked on the door. Well, I had a pickup truck at the time, and the window wouldn't roll up. And I had mentioned to her when I saw her that the window didn't roll up. So he said, I'm here to fix the window on your pickup. So he went out and fixed it with WD-40. I didn't know that's what it took. And then he asked me out on a date. We went out for pizza. And the next thing I know, we were dating seriously. So that was it.
Do you have a favorite date or a most memorable date from when you were first meeting?
So we went out to dinner with his mom and stepfather to the Elks Club. And I don't know if you remember this, but that was one of the buildings I used to clean. And I would take you and Jeremy there with me. And I would clean in the morning before like 6 o'clock in the morning. And they had a TV in the lounge area. And if you guys were awake, I'd turn on cartoons. If you were asleep, I'd just lay you on the couch and cover you up while I cleaned. So we went to the Elks Club for dinner, and all I remember is that you had to go to the bathroom, and I got up to take you, and he said, I'll take him so he can go into the men's room. So he took you to the bathroom and came back pretty surprised that you didn't know how to stand up to go to the bathroom. And so, and so that was the first lesson that he taught you.
That was my first time in the men's room.
Yeah, first time in the men's room.
I didn't know that. Dad taught me how to stand up to pee. What was I, 4 years old?
Probably
3? 4?
Yeah, probably 4.
Okay.
So
I remember growing up, and I don't know if this is a small town thing, but John was just John Kelly all the time, his first and middle name.
Right.
Like constantly, it just rolled off the tongue.
And
John
he didn't like it when he got to be an adult.
Mm-hmm. No, I can imagine.
Levi Jacob.
But I wasn't born Levi Jacob.
No.
I was born Levi William Stephenson. And I became Levi Jacob Anderson when Dad adopted me legally.
Yes.
Where did the name Jacob come from?
That was my grandfather's middle name,
Okay.
Russell Jacob Shannon.
Gotcha.
Loved him.
So this is taking me off track a little bit, but there's a history, I think, at least from my perspective in our families, of stepdads really stepping up to the plate. Grandpa Hook was a stepdad, right?
Yes.
Right? My Grandpa Stephenson was a stepdad. Grandpa Kelly was a stepdad. Dad was a stepdad. John's a stepdad. I'm very likely, if I ever do get married, at this day and age, will end up being a stepdad.
Okay.
My brother Wesley's a stepdad.
I didn't know that.
And I don't know, it really is, Dad has always been dad to me. But I think it's taken a step away from the mom topic, but I thought about that a while back. I was noticing that kind of a trend, and I think it's worth mentioning how important that is to, a family is really about taking care of one another and taking care of the responsibilities of just being a provider for the family. And I think it's really awesome.
It is awesome. Yeah, and I'll tell you that when my dad made his very first will, at that time, because of the way the laws were, he was not allowed to put my older brothers and sisters in the will as his stepchildren. He had to call them his friends and name them by name, along with his children, along with Jeff and Scott and I. So when he was at the attorney's office, he cried because that hurt him so bad that he couldn't call them in the will his children.
Wow.
So, yeah. So that's how much love there was. And his mother accepted the 4 older ones as grandchildren. And my Uncle Don, he married a woman who had 2 girls, and she accepted them like her granddaughters. And Uncle Pee Wee had, when he married Aunt Tootie, she had 2 children already. So she accepted them. So that, there's a level of acceptance. My dad always felt that even when people marry into the family, they're family. Mm-hmm. So family means more than just birthright.
It certainly does. What was I like as a little kid?
Well, other than eating anything that wasn't on the menu, when you were a toddler, you were very quiet and very shy. So, for example, at B&C Grocery Store, the local grocery store, they had a display of magazines, including comic books. And when I would go to the grocery store, you would sit down with the permission of the owner. She didn't mind at all, but you would sit down and you would look through comic books while I bought the groceries. Well, one day, after buying groceries and I got home and was putting the groceries away, I thought, where's Levi? And I had left you at the store. And so I went back to the store to get you, and I was all panicked. And the store owner, Carrie, was like, she didn't even know you were still there because you were still sitting in front of the display of magazines reading comic books. You were always quiet. And when I would clean houses, I could take you with me and with just a little bag of your toys and set you in the middle of whatever room, and you would play quietly. You never made a disturbance at all. Then when you started school, your best friend was Margaret Schott. You were so nervous about going to school that you would wait outside the front doors of the school until Margaret got there, and nobody could get you in until Margaret got there. And then the kindergarten teacher, Mrs. Bear, told me that she had to sit you right next to Margaret because you couldn't handle it if Margaret wasn't right there next to you. And then she kind of had to wean Margaret away from you because she moved Margaret across the table from you and then slowly moved Margaret down a little bit so you would interact with the other kids because you were so attached to Margaret. Very attached to Margaret.
She brought me out of my shell because I'm not the quiet one anymore.
No.
I do remember it like...
You actually stood out in the rain one day because you wouldn't go in the school because Margaret wasn't there yet.
I got a thing for redheads.
You have a little red. You have a little red in your hair.
So then in high school, how was I different in high school versus being a little kid?
Well, you were still somewhat attached to Margaret because I remember getting a call one day from Mrs. Hamner because it was lunchtime and she had seen Margaret driving your Blazer with you attached to the top of it.
Like Teen Wolf.
I don't know where it came from. So I went to the school and I asked if they could please take Levi out of class, and I made you give me your car keys.
Yes. I remember that. It was very embarrassing.
Yeah.
To have your mom come into class and take your car keys from you.
I just couldn't imagine that in high school, as smart as you and Margaret are, you couldn't think to do that out of town, but you had to do it in town where you'd be driving past a lot of people.
Small towns don't need detectives. So why do you love Jeremy more than me?
I don't love Jeremy more than you.
You hear that, Jeremy?
He's my favorite from Utah.
Yeah. Who's your favorite son from Oregon?
My favorite son from Southern Oregon is you. And my favorite son that lives just outside of Condon is John. Mm-hmm. He's also my favorite youngest son, and you're my favorite middle son.
Fair enough. So what is it that you're involved in these days? Like, you're basically, in theory, retired from work, but you never stop working.
So volunteer-wise, I volunteered for a lot of things. I've been a member of the Chamber of Commerce for a number of years. I've been president twice. I was the treasurer for a while until I retired from my Columbia Basin Electric Board. And when I retired from that, I decided I'd finish out my term for each of the boards that I was on. And so I retired from the Chamber of Commerce Board. I'm still active. I retired from the Historical Society Board, but I volunteer. And right now, what I did was I wrote a grant for a cataloging program so that all of the items that have been donated to our Historical Society can be cataloged. And our Historical Society has a complex that has a number of buildings. It's almost like a village, and each of the buildings is decorated or outfitted to period. And we have a lot of photographs, even from the 1800s, that were in danger of deteriorating. And actually, a young man that you went to school with, Jason Campbell, was elected to the board, and it hadn't been anything that anybody had mentioned, at least as far as I know, when he said our photographs are in danger of just decaying beyond being salvaged. And so I wrote this grant for this program to catalog. And so right now, the project that I'm working on is scanning all the photos that we have and putting them into this cataloging program with all the information that we have about the photos. So, and then the other problem we have locally is the lack of childcare or problems with the childcare system and not always being able to take children that need to have childcare. And so I'm watching our youngest grandson, Jack, who's 3 years old. I'm watching him 2 Fridays a month. That's what I'm spending my time doing.
So back to the electric cooperative you were with for so long. Mm-hmm. Why was that so important to you as far as being, like, what a lot of people that are watching or will be listening to this don't understand what a rural electric cooperative means, because they're used to being in the city and being on just a standard power grid from like Pacific Power or something like that.
Okay, so what makes a co-op different is that the business itself is owned by the people who use it. So the consumers own the co-op. Mm-hmm. So instead of a profit going to stockholders, the profit goes back to the consumers. So it gets banked for a number of years before they retire it and give it back. So I think right now we're at 27 years out in returning those profits from prior years, and that money is used as capital for the business in the meantime. And the reason that I got involved with it is there was the director from our city, from our town, was Fred Greiner, and he was ill and couldn't continue, so he retired from the board, and there was an opening, and they advertised in the paper, and nobody was stepping up to the plate. Well, at the time, I had my Uncle Arnie, my Uncle Marty, my Uncle John, my Uncle Harley, all were linemen for Illinois Gas and Electric Company in Illinois. And I thought, how does a business run itself if there's nobody willing to step forward to do the management that needs to be done? And the management of the board is to manage policies, to set policies, and the only employee that we have under us is the general manager. So that's why I was interested. Also, my cousin Bart and my sister Marcy also worked for that company. So, not at the time, but they worked for the company. So the electric industry was always part of my family history. So that's why I stepped forward. So, and I was interviewed for the position along with the recently retired County Sheriff Volney Thomas, and they chose me. And then the next annual meeting, I was elected to the board. So that's why it was interesting. And then when the federated insurance position became available, because I worked in insurance for all those years at Hudson Insurance, Federated Insurance is the insurance company that insures 90% of the co-ops in the United States. I thought that would be a good position for me to run for, and that I ran against an incumbent in that position. So that served 9 states in the United States, in the western part of the United States.
Very cool.
Okay.
So you're still a mom, but now you're a grandma.
That's right.
How is it different from being a mom?
Well, you can give them candy and they can go home hyper. So it can be challenging at times. I'm sad that I'm not closer to Jeremy and that I don't get to see Declan and Colby as often as I would like to. Doesn't mean you love them any less. It's just different to have them in town with you. So I do get to take in a lot of Olivia's activities. And, you know, for years after you boys had all gone off to college, Dad and I quit going to the county fair because there was a flea market that we loved to go to up in the mountains every Labor Day. And
It's very country of you.
yes. So the first year that Olivia had something in the fair, we went up to the fairgrounds so she could show us her sheep and show us everything before we left for the mountains. And after that first year, I told Dad, I said, we can't do that anymore. We have to stay in town for the fair now that they live near us and we can at least take it in. So it's fun to be at the fair with the kids. And, you know, even though Olivia's 13 now and, you know, her friends are the most important things, it's still, you can see the smile on her face when she looks in the audience and she sees us, or that she gets to show us herself, her steer, and or her, she also had sheep before, but this year she had a steer. So it's just, you can step in whenever they need you. Jeremy calls and says, can you come, Mom, and stay for this many days with the kids? He did that 2 years ago, and I did. I went and stayed. So
But
it's
you don't have to be there 24/7 like when you were raising us.
No, I don't.
What were some of the most difficult struggles you had raising us boys?
Well, in the early years, money was tight. So, and I think in a way that's a good thing for families to experience, to grow together in how they build up their assets. But so it was a struggle when I was a single mom. There were a lot of things that you don't know that I did without. I forgot your question.
What was some of the biggest challenges raising us boys? And I mean, money, I think it's a universal. A lot of people can kind of understand like the limits of that, but
Yeah.
I don't know if there's anything specific that.
Well, challenging
Really,
when because everybody gets into trouble at one time or another, and you want to like make sure that they grow from the experience, and you don't want to shut them out entirely. It's and it's a balancing act, and sometimes we failed and sometimes we didn't. So it's just a struggle to make sure, because you want them to always do the right thing, become good people. And it did work out. All three of you are good people. So you're all kind. You're all good with children. You all have good heart. So
Out of the three of us, who was the one you you least likely expected to turn out well? Who was the one you were really worried about turning out well? John? It was John, not me.
well, John was a challenge because he put pressure on himself that I didn't realize until he was a grown man, because he felt like he was failing because he wasn't learning, didn't come as easy to him as it did to you and Jeremy. I don't think he felt that he was stupid, or maybe he did feel that way because he didn't learn as quickly. People learn different ways. So that was a challenge that he overcame.
Well, and people have different priorities. Jeremy, it was tough growing up under Jeremy because he was great at academics. He was great at sports. He was great on his saxophone. He got NCAA college scholarship for playing saxophone and for being smart. And I went to a public state college because it was in state and I could afford it. John had so much more of a social nature. He was a total, everybody loved hanging out with him, and he had, skills levels that I never did. And so I think.
But in high school, I think you were pretty well liked.
Somewhat.
Somewhat?
I faked it. I was my freshman year, so after Jeremy had left, I kind of got to come into his legacy. That's one of those things, but also I got picked on right out of the gate, because I was a scrawny little dork. But I was the cliche of when one of the jocks comes to stuff you in a locker. One of the other football players comes out and says, "No, you don't touch Levi because he helps me with my math homework."
Oh, shoot. Well, I remember John was an entrepreneur because he figured out ways to make money.
Yes, very much so.
And I got a call one time from the clinic because he had broken his foot. And even after he broke it and was in a cast, Mom sat on it twice by mistake. But it came a point where before he had his cast taken off, his foot began to smell pretty bad. And so he decided to cure that by pouring aftershave down his cast, which made it very much worse. So I got a call from the clinic the day he was supposed to get his cast off, and it was from the PA, Dennis. And Dennis said, "Lori, I want to let you know that John's getting he's getting his cast off today, but we're not going to let him keep it." And I'm like, "Well, why would he want to keep it?" And Dennis said, "Because he took money from kids at school to put it in so-and-so's locker over the weekend." I said, "Good, don't let him have it."
He was definitely an entrepreneur. That was, I think, one of the. I was a little jealous because when he came down to go to college down here too, and so we got to reconnect after years of when I was away and he was still in high school. We got to be really close to each other, and I still struggle with that. We're in my studio that I don't know how I'm affording it just quite yet, but I know I love it, this passion. But he was just super savvy out of the gate, and that's something I really envied about him.
I think I was late picking him up after one semester because I was coming through, I think, McKenzie Pass. Is that when you leave Bend? Is that the pass? Anyway, out of Sisters, as you enter the pass, there was no sign that the pass was closed. Got into the pass, and the pass was closed, so I had to backtrack and go around. And it was pre-cell phone. So I got to the college, and it had been raining, and he was sitting outside because they put him out of his dorm. And he was sitting there with all of his stuff in the rain. Poor kid.
Waiting for Margaret shot. Oh. So, do you have any favorite memories that just you'll treasure forever from your days as a mom? I know we're grown up now and we're still your kids, but
I loved the school programs only because they weren't
you didn't have to do the work.
5-star, but they were my kids. I remember not only leaving you at B&C Grocery, but locking you out of the office when you were there after school one day because I went to get the mail because, again, you were still at that very quiet age and I didn't realize that you were in the office. And you were smart enough, because you still have those common sense smarts, to call Dad at work. And he came, when I came back from the post, I just went to the post office, which is across the street, and I came back, and you're standing on one side of the door, and Dad's standing on the other side of the door saying, she's going to be back any minute, because there was a note on the door that said I went to the post office. So
he was locked out, so he couldn't get me out. He just had to stand there and comfort me.
He had to stand there and comfort you. When I told my boss about it, he said, Lori, tell Levi if it ever happens again to just go up the back stairs and go out the door of the apartment because he can get out that way. I said, oh, I already handled it. I told him if it ever happens again to pick up a chair and break the window in the front of the office.
What would I do if I went out the back and I didn't know where you were anyways? I'd just be wandering the streets. I think I was very attached to you.
Well, I have to tell you that there was a scare in town just because we're remote. Mothers still worried about their kids being safe. And there was one time that Kathy Burris was cutting hair at the time, and she couldn't get away because she had people in the office, and she called me. Carrie hadn't shown up after school. And I could get away because there was a second person in the office. And so I went driving around to try to find Carrie. Again, pre-cell phone days. So I called her and I said, I can't find her. And she said, it's okay. She was just late. She was meandering. She was late. Then there was another time that I was driving towards Fossil, and I wasn't very far into that canyon. And here was Keith Potter, maybe 9 years old, riding his bicycle. I know no parent would let a kid ride their bike to Fossil. And I pulled over and I said, Keith, where are you going? He said, I'm going to Fossil. And I said, does your mom know? And he said, yes. And I said, no, she doesn't. And I made him get in the car and put his bike in the back of the car and turned around and took him home. We watch out for other kids. And we still worry, even in a small town, because things do happen. And we all love our kids, and we know that we love everybody else's kids. So there's times that I know I worried about you boys, different things. I worried about all of you being away at college. I worried about when you left your car keys in your luggage in Pendleton when you were coming home from some school event.
That was Jeremy, wasn't it?
No, he left his in his luggage when he flew. You left yours after that when you were being bussed. And it's just, those kind of things. You hope that they learn a lesson from it. You didn't learn from Jeremy's lesson, but you did learn the lesson, I think, not to pack your car keys.
Well, I didn't check my bags with my keys in.
And you also didn't go to the most expensive hotel in the area and get room service. So thank you for that.
I didn't.
Jeremy did.
But I did book your room at one of my favorite hotels for this weekend.
You did. I told Dad when I called him this morning, I said, next time we come to Ashland, we're staying in this hotel.
It's nice.
It is.
Well, my card's on file for amenities, but there's not much on there, so don't run up too much room service.
Thank you very much. That was sweet of you.
They've treated me well there, so.
It sounds like it. So
And
I'm always impressed when I get to meet friends that you've made because they all have very nice things to say about you. So
so are you proud of me now?
I am proud of. I've always been proud of you, except for certain instances, but not in the whole. I've always been proud of you, in the whole.
What
And I can
was-
say that for all my boys. So like when you got into trouble,
I've
whenever.
never been in trouble.
Well, now I know that you've been in more trouble than I even knew about.
Oh,
You know, laying on top of a moving vehicle, that's trouble. That's concerning. That's not my proudest moment as a mom.
I want to be selfish and ask just about me, but for all
Okay.
three of us boys, when we were little versus where we are now, are they like how close to the past are we on that you envisioned? Like, did you have when you saw us running around like ideas of like, oh, this kid's gonna grow up to do this or that and the other, versus where we've ended up? Do you have? Is
It's
there?
really funny because all I really wanted is for you guys to find something that made you happy.
Yeah.
And I think out of the three that you're the one who's done that. You keep working at what you want to do that makes you happy. So I see that, like, Jeremy has a really good job. He does work that's productive and, you know, good for humanity, doing the research and medical research that he's worked on all these years. John didn't want to grow up and be an insurance guy. You know, he loves the outdoors. Jeremy loves the outdoors. I think in their jobs, they're not as happy as I wish they were. For me, the insurance job was, I would have been happy. I've always been happy in whatever work I do. And I think that comes from my dad because he was always like, if you can't have fun, don't go, is a saying he used to say. I just had fun in whatever job I did. I mean, my first job was a newspaper person. Actually, I didn't like that one because people didn't always pay. And in the newspaper business at that time, they didn't pay direct to the newspaper company. You had to go collect for the paper. And if people didn't pay you, that was on you. So I did not like that job. Then I worked at a local motel cleaning rooms. I was still underage. I started the newspaper route at 9. At 11, I worked at the motel, and they paid me 50 cents an hour was what I started at. If you can imagine what that was like. That was good money back then. But I could clean, on a good day, I could clean a room in half an hour. So that, I mean, you go in, you strip it, and you do all the cleaning and move on to the next one, and had it down to a science. And I just enjoyed that. My girlfriend up the street worked there with me. I actually, even though I took different jobs over the years, if I had free time on the weekends, I always went in and worked at the motel and made a little extra money. The next job I had was when I was 14, and you had to get a work permit, so that was the first legal job I had, was at a restaurant, and I was a dishwasher. And I liked that job because I got to work with my sister-in-law, Pat, and her mother was wonderful. Her sister was not the nicest person to work with because when I first started working there, they didn't have a dishwashing machine. So I had to wash the dishes by hand. Then they got the dishwashers shortly after I started working there, and the rule was that if you broke a dish, it came out of your pay. Well, one day I actually dropped the whole, because they had extra racks, and I would load the rack and then put them in the dishwasher. I actually dropped a whole rack of dishes. And of course, my heart sank because I know that was coming out of my pay. And Pat's sister came around the corner, and she got out her pen and paper, and she started writing down what I broke. And I just looked at her, and I told her, I said, you cannot I can count myself. So, but I liked that job. And then when I finally got used to the routine of that, I would bus the tables. And, you just got to meet people in the community. The waitress or the cook was Hazel. And I remember she was a short little woman. She was so fun to work with, and there was spices up on a high shelf, and she said, "Lori, will you get the orango down for me?" And then I worked at Turnstile, which was a department store, and I was hired to be a cashier, and the first day I showed up, I was trained. The first day I showed up for work, I was in the women's department, and my boss said, do you know why I asked to have you in my department? And I said, no, I don't. She says, on your application where it asked previous experience, you wrote dishwasher. Anybody that'll wash dishes is a hard worker, she said.
Oh.
And I was the first girl to work in the warehouse on the racks, and you had to climb them like a monkey to get all the clothes and stuff off the hangers down from the racks. So I enjoyed that, and then I went to work at the insurance company, and then I worked at Penny's. I mean, I just worked different jobs. And Penny's didn't tell me, I didn't like this. Penny's didn't tell me they were hiring me just through Christmas. Then at Christmas time, they laid me off. But when it came time to do inventory, which was after the 1st of January, they called me back to do that. So it wasn't that I wasn't a good worker for them. It's just I didn't appreciate that they didn't tell me.
Yeah.
So there's lessons learned from working for different people that I thought, if I'm ever a boss, I don't want to do that. And I think that has proven true when Dad and I started, the farming together, because he was good about training people, not asking him to do something that he wouldn't do himself. The only bad thing about bookkeeping is when you have employees that take advantage. That was a hard thing for anybody. What was the question?
I don't remember.
I don't either. See, you love what you do. That was what the question was. You love what you do. I think Jeremy and John try to do a good job at what they do, but I don't think John loves being an insurance agent, and I don't think Jeremy loves working indoors. I think
they find a lot of love and passion with their families. I totally see gleams in their eyes on that, and that's something that I haven't really found for myself yet. But there is, I've got to chase my passion because I hadn't had a family, right? I don't have that other responsibility to take care of. I know growing up with you and Dad, if by happenstance I would have, fallen for someone, had a kid either on purpose or not, I would have just turned around and buckled down and done what's right. And but I haven't had to, so I get to keep exploring. I get to fail, and no one else has to suffer but me, so I can move on from that pretty easily. And I think a lot of it, I did learn a work ethic from Dad that really was, you get the job done. What else are you going to do? Like, it's going to be there. If it's broken, it's not going to run until you fix it. Just do it now, get it over with, because the next thing is going to be right around the corner, and you grind away and you get it done right. And I think I picked up from you a lot of what you were saying about how you can just find fun in whatever you're doing. That can get you through it, right? Whether it's like, do I want to be a dishwasher? No, but when I'm with people I like, yes. When I first got to school, I did that. I started as a dishwasher. I worked all the way up to lead chef in that restaurant, the Plaza Cafe. And it was because everyone there was so, like, they were family. It was a fun place to be. It wasn't about the work. But being able to find that joy in there. I saw you work hard. I don't think I picked up on it, but I know it's ingrained in me. That same thing of, like, I'll always find something. I'm juggling 12 projects in 3 or 4 different industries at any given point in time. And I definitely must have picked that up from you.
Well, I think Jeremy and John like their job. And I think they both do their best at their job. So I'm not saying that they don't like their job. I think about my dad, because he worked 30 years running the same machine at International Harvester, which you can't like that. I mean, you can't love that. But he went to work every day with his best friend. They drove together and they left early because they would sit out in the parking lot and visit before they went into work. His friend was Round Belly, and he called him that. My dad had nicknames for everybody. He had a sense of right and wrong, and he sent me an article out of the newspaper one time, and it was when he was arrested. And he was arrested for not paying personal property tax. And he was not going to pay personal property tax because he said, I already paid tax on all the furniture in my house when I bought it. So this is double taxation and I'm not paying it. Until they came to International Harvester and arrested him at work and took him to jail. And he thought, I have 6 kids at home, considered us all babies at that point, and said, I can't be in jail because I have to provide for them. And so he called his brother and said, bail me out and let me get this taken care of. And so it was right of him not to want to pay that personal property tax. And they did away with that eventually in Illinois.
Yeah.
But at one time they were charging you tax twice, which is what our country was originally founded on. Tax, we don't want to be taxed.
Right.
So
They still find ways to tax us on everything now.
yeah, and there is so many ways that they double tax us. So, but it just makes you see that there's a point where your principles have to sometimes take aside because of your family. So, you just made me think of my dad. But he had fun going to work.
Yeah. Well, and I think that permeates through the whole family. Grandpa Hook really had a personality that every one of my cousins still talks about him. Anytime we visit about anything, Grandpa Hook's going to come up in the conversation. Including what was the tattoo that he had on his arm?
Mother.
For years, you denied that he had that tattoo, and I think you were just trying to avoid us getting tattoos.
He did not want anybody to get tattoos because when he was older, it was pretty wrinkled. But when he put that in there was I never knew until the Desert Storm Wars. I never had a clue as to what the mothers of kids who went away to war went through. It hit me pretty hard when Scott had to go to that. I'm not saying it's anything like what mothers went through, but there was a letter that my grandfather wrote when he was in danger of losing his property on the Mississippi River because the Corps of Engineers wanted to buy up all the property on the Mississippi River, or the government did. And he wrote to the Corps of Engineers and said, I served in 2 wars. All my sons served in war. We've honored the lease that he had on the property. He had a 99-year lease on that property. And he went into quite a description about, serving in the war. And then I think about my grandmothers and when their children went to war. And my dad actually got called into his commander of whatever division he was in, got called into the office because he had received a letter from my grandma, and it said, how come my son hasn't written me? And the commander said, you will write to your mother. And I know that this happened because my cousin sent me one of the letters that my dad wrote to his brothers that said he got in trouble for not writing to his mother. So, I think that it just brought to me when Scott went to war some of what they must have felt like to have their kids in that kind of danger. I don't want that for any mother. So, but my grandfather's letter, years later, My cousin, who works for the Army Corps of Engineers, was cleaning out a file cabinet and came across the original of that letter. I think it was 3 pages long,
Oh, wow.
the letter that he had written. And that was my cousin Denny Shannon. And he's about the same age as Scott, so he really didn't know Grandpa Shannon very well at all. But can you imagine pulling that out of a drawer and reading that and it being your grandfather's paper, pen, hands on that paper?
Yeah.
That's
It's
kind
gonna
of,
be crazy.
yeah, really crazy that he was the one that found that. Again, what was the question?
I don't know. I don't know that I have any more.
Okay.
Or I have 100 more, but I just don't want to keep you here for too long. What's it been?
You're going to edit this, right?
This has been over an hour. I thought it was going to be like a 20, 30-minute little sit down
Okay.
with you, Mom. Thank you for being here.
Was it any good?
Being my very first podcast guest ever.
Was it any good?
I mean,
You edit it, right? You do edit it.
no, you
Yes,
can't edit podcasts.
Yes, you
that's the
can.
whole. That's the value in them. Is it's all just stream of consciousness.
Not true.
I'm just going to edit down to the portion where you said, I'm the best
Okay.
of the 3 boys. Your favorite, and then I'll cut out the in Southern Oregon.
That came from my dad, you know.
Yes.
I was his favorite daughter in Oregon, Holly the favorite in New Jersey, and so on and so forth, because we all live in 7 different states. Mostly the state of confusion.
Yeah.
But years ago, Scott's first marriage, and we were in, North Carolina, Fayetteville, when Hurricane Hugo hit.
Okay.
So I think that was in the late 80s. Anyway, the Miss America pageant had just happened in New Jersey. So we, after the reception and a lot of drinking, we had at the hotel that we stayed in our own Miss America pageant. So we had contestants. We had mistake. We had misinformed.
Misdemeanor.
Misdemeanor. Yep.
You were such a good mom at keeping us in line that it's hard to picture you as like a party animal. But when I see you with Aunt Holly, I know there's a history of you probably getting wild and having a lot of fun.
We did get in trouble, just so you know.
Oh, I'm sure of it. With 6 kids,
7.
running 7.
Who's counting?
I don't know. Apparently not Grandma and Grandpa.
Well, Scott did ask me one time, just a couple years ago, he said, he asked, was I a mistake? I said, back in that time period with contraception and the way it was, we were all mistakes. Right?
Was I your greatest mistake?
Oh my gosh.
Thank you for being here, Mom.
You're welcome. Love you.
Love you.
Okay. Cut.